Born December 10, 1966, Alfred J. Gaynor grew up in Springfield. He was a familiar face in the community, a blue-collar worker who held odd jobs, including at an auto repair shop. But beneath the surface, Gaynor battled addiction and harbored a darkness no one saw coming. Neighbors described him as quiet and ordinary. That ordinariness was his camouflage. It allowed him to walk among his victims without suspicion. The killings began in April 1995 when Vera Hallams was found murdered in her home. At first, police believed it was an isolated tragedy. But then came Amy Smith, a 20-year-old whose death would later reveal a disturbing connection. By mid-1996, Springfield police were facing a grim reality. A serial killer was stalking their streets. Detectives compared crime scenes. The method was disturbingly consistent: strangulation, often after sexual assault. Many victims were found partially clothed, suggesting they'd been lured or caught off guard. The media dubbed him the Springfield Strangler. The city lived in fear, but Gaynor moved freely, confident he would never be caught. On April 10, 1998, Alfred J. Gaynor was taken into custody. Under questioning, he began to talk, and what he revealed left investigators stunned. One by one, he confessed to the murders of 9 women. In chilling detail, he described how he chose his victims, how he ended their lives, and why he felt no remorse. Gaynor faced 8 counts of first-degree murder. In 2000, he was convicted and sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences without parole. In 2008, he pleaded guilty to the murder of Vera Hallams, adding another life term to his record. Gerald Eugene Stano was born Paul Zeininger on September 12, 1951, in upstate New York, the 3rd child given up for adoption. County doctors noted he was so neglected in infancy that he reportedly functioned at an animalistic level, even consuming his own feces to survive, a cruel omen of the darkness that lay ahead. Adopted by a nurse named Norma Stano, he became Gerald Eugene Stano. Despite a seemingly nurturing home, his childhood remained haunted by behavioral issues, lies, theft, and utter social isolation. By the early 1970s, Stano had begun a killing spree that would eventually span multiple states. His first admitted murder occurred in New Jersey in 1969, but it was in Florida that his crimes reached gruesome notoriety. In 1973, the bodies of 2 teenage girls, Janine Marie Ligotino and Anne Eugenia Arsenault, were found in Gainesville. Later that same year, 16-year-old Barbara Ann Bauer was abducted from a shopping mall and strangled in Bradford County. One of his earliest known victims was 17-year-old hitchhiker Kathy Lee Scharf, found strangled in the Merritt Island Wildlife Refuge in early 1974. Over the next several years, Stano preyed on young women and girls, many vulnerable runaways or hitchhikers, killing them in chillingly similar ways, often with their bodies posed or covered with branches. On April 1, 1980, following a brutal attack on a prostitute named Donna Hensley, who escaped and alerted authorities, Stano was arrested. She identified him, and during interrogation, Stano shocked officials by confessing to dozens more murders, far beyond what he'd initially admitted. Officially, he was tied to at least 23 confirmed killings and confessed to 41. Though investigators suspected he may have been responsible for up to 88 murders across Florida, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. Stano's legal downfall reached its peak when he pled guilty in 1981 to the murders of Susan Bickrest and Mary Kathleen Muldoon, earning death sentences. He was also convicted in 1983 for the murder of Kathy Lee Scharf and handed a 3rd death sentence alongside 8 life terms. After years of appeals and delays, including stays of execution, he was executed by electrocution in Florida State Prison on March 23, 1998. In a final haunting chapter, Genetic Genealogy in 2024 identified a long unresolved Jane Doe as Pamela K. Whitman, a 25-year-old victim found in 1980 along I-95 in Florida as one of Stano's victims. Henry Louis Wallace, born November 4, 1965, in Barnwell, South Carolina, grew up in poverty under the care of a strict single mother. His early years were marked by instability and trouble. In high school, he was considered intelligent, but often got into mischief, later serving briefly in the U.S. Navy before drifting through a series of low-paying jobs. By the early 1990s, Wallace had settled in Charlotte, North Carolina, and on the surface appeared to be a friendly, dependable man. In reality, he was concealing a horrifying secret. He was a serial killer preying on women in his own social circle. Between 1992 and 1994, Wallace murdered at least 11 women, most of them young African-American women whom he knew personally, friends, co-workers, or acquaintances of his girlfriend. His victims included Carolyn Love, a co-worker of Wallace's girlfriend who disappeared in 1992 and was later found strangled; Shauna Hawk, the goddaughter of a local police officer; Audrey Spain, a fast food restaurant co-worker; and Deborah Slaughter, among others. Wallace typically gained entry to their homes by exploiting their trust, then sexually assaulted and strangled them, often leaving their bodies posed or covered afterward. The string of murders terrified Charlotte's black community, but because the victims were all young black women connected to Wallace socially, and because the killings occurred over a span of 2 years without a clear pattern, police initially failed to link them. Wallace attended some of the victims' funerals, consoled their families, and even discussed the cases with detectives who had no idea the killer was sitting in front of them. On March 13, 1994, police finally connected Wallace to the crimes after the murder of Deborah Slaughter and the disappearance of another victim, Vanessa Mack. Confronted with mounting evidence, Wallace was arrested on March 12, 1994. In custody, he confessed in chilling detail to 11 murders, describing each attack without remorse. His trial began in 1996, and prosecutors painted him as a calculating predator who used familiarity as a weapon. Wallace was convicted on 9 counts of first-degree murder and was sentenced to death. Appeals followed for years, but the outcome never changed. Wallace's case drew national attention not only because of the sheer number of victims, but also because of the failure of law enforcement to recognize the pattern sooner, a lapse many critics argued was influenced by the victim's race and social status. Henry Louis Wallace remains on death row at Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina. Chester Duane Turner, born November 5, 1966, in Warren, Arkansas, grew up in Los Angeles, California, after his parents separated when he was a child. His mother worked long hours to support the family, and Turner's early life was shaped by poverty, instability, and time spent in the rough neighborhoods of South Central Los Angeles. From 1987 to 1998, Turner preyed on vulnerable women, many of them sex workers, drug addicts, or women experiencing homelessness. His method was almost always the same. He would approach them under the pretense of sex, then strangle them to death. The killings were brutal, and his victims were discarded in alleyways, near freeways, behind buildings, or in abandoned structures in downtown Los Angeles and surrounding neighborhoods. His victims included Annette Ernest, the first linked to him, Anita Fishman, Regina Washington, who was 6 months pregnant at the time of her murder, and several others whose lives ended in sudden, violent encounters with him. For years, the murders remained unsolved, scattered across multiple crime scenes and handled by different detectives. At the time, DNA technology was in its infancy, and the LAPD was overwhelmed by high homicide rates. As a result, Turner's crimes were buried in the chaos, with investigators unaware they were chasing the same man. Turner, meanwhile, was in and out of jail on unrelated charges, continuing to kill between arrests. It wasn't until 2002, years after many of the murders, that advances in DNA testing linked semen samples from multiple crime scenes to Turner. By then, he was already serving time for sexually violating and killing another woman in 2002. In 2007, Turner was convicted of killing 10 women and a full-term unborn child. He was sentenced to death and sent to San Quentin State Prison. In 2014, Turner was convicted of 4 additional murders, bringing his confirmed total to 14, though police believe the true number could be higher. Turner remains on death row, one of the deadliest serial killers in California history. Samuel Little, born Samuel McDowell on June 7, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia, would go on to be recognized by the FBI as the most prolific serial killer in United States history. Raised mainly by his grandmother in Ohio, Little had a troubled childhood marked by neglect, petty crime, and frequent run-ins with the law. By his teenage years, he had already been arrested for theft and burglary. He later claimed that his violent impulses, particularly toward women, began to surface as early as high school. Throughout the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, Little drifted across the country, living as a transient. He survived through theft, shoplifting, and odd jobs, but his real pattern was darker. He targeted vulnerable women, often sex workers or those battling addiction who were less likely to be reported missing. His method of killing was usually manual strangulation, sometimes combined with blunt force trauma. This choice of method often left little physical evidence, making his murders difficult to classify as homicides at the time. Many were written off as drug overdoses or accidental deaths. Little moved from state to state, Florida, Ohio, Texas, California, Mississippi, Louisiana, leaving behind a trail of victims. He was arrested numerous times over the decades for assault, robbery, and rape, but consistently managed to avoid long prison sentences. His nomadic lifestyle and tendency to target society's most marginalized women allowed him to evade detection for decades. The breakthrough came in 2012 when Little was arrested in a Kentucky homeless shelter on a drug charge and extradited to California on an old narcotics warrant. While in custody, his DNA was matched to 3 unsolved murders from the late 1980s in Los Angeles County. Victims Carol Eileen Elford, Guadalupe Duarte Apodaca, and Audrey Nelson Everett. These cases shared his signature: strangulation of vulnerable women. In 2014, Little was convicted of those 3 murders and sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without parole. While in prison, FBI analysts and Texas Ranger James Holland began interviewing him. Little proved surprisingly willing to talk, on one condition: he wanted to be transferred to a different prison. Once accommodated, he began confessing to a staggering number of murders, offering vivid recollections of his victims' appearances, clothing, and where he had dumped their bodies. He even sketched portraits of many of the women from memory. By the time investigators finished corroborating his confessions, Samuel Little had admitted to killing 93 women between 1970 and 2005. Law enforcement was able to confirm at least 60 of those murders, making him the most prolific known serial killer in U.S. history. His victims ranged in age from teenagers to women in their 40s, and his killings spanned at least 19 states. Samuel Little died on December 30th, 2020, at the age of 80 in a California prison. Even in death, many of his confessions remain unverified, and dozens of victims remain unidentified. For the families of the confirmed victims, his confessions finally brought answers after decades of uncertainty. For law enforcement, Little's case exposed how systemic indifference toward marginalized victims allowed one of the deadliest predators in American history to operate in plain sight for more than 3 decades. Lonnie David Franklin Jr., later known as the Grim Sleeper, was born on August 30th, 1952, in South Los Angeles, California. To his neighbors, he seemed like a quiet, friendly man, a devoted father, a backyard mechanic who worked on cars in his yard, someone who waved at people on the street. Between 1985 and 2007, Franklin preyed on vulnerable women in South Los Angeles, targeting mostly young black women who struggled with poverty, drug addiction, or life on the streets. He lured them in with offers of money, food, or drugs before sexually assaulting and murdering them, usually by shooting or strangulation. After killing them, he discarded their bodies in alleys, dumpsters, and abandoned lots, often within walking distance of his home. His known victims included Deborah Jackson, Barbara Ware, Bernita Sparks, and Janetia Peters, among others. Franklin's crimes were particularly chilling, not just for their brutality, but for the long gap in the middle of his killing spree. After a cluster of murders in the late 1980s, the killings seemed to stop for more than a decade, from 1988 to 2002, earning him the nickname the Grim Sleeper from the press. For years, the murders baffled investigators. The Los Angeles Police Department eventually linked the killings through ballistics and DNA evidence, but the identity of the killer remained elusive. The breakthrough came in 2010 when detectives used a controversial technique known as familial DNA searching. They found a partial match between crime scene DNA and Christopher Franklin, Lonnie's son, who had been arrested on a weapons charge. This led police to Lonnie Franklin himself. Investigators covertly collected Franklin's DNA from pizza crust and utensils discarded at a restaurant. The results were a perfect match to DNA recovered from multiple murder scenes. When police searched his home, they found a disturbing cache: photographs of hundreds of women, many of whom have never been identified, raising fears that Franklin's victim count could be far higher than the 10 murders for which he was charged. In 2016, after a lengthy trial, Lonnie Franklin Jr. was convicted of 10 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. He was sentenced to death. On March 28, 2020, Franklin was found dead in his cell at San Quentin State Prison. The cause of death was never publicly disclosed, though foul play was ruled out. He was officially convicted of 10 murders, but it is believed the numbers were higher, up to 160 victims. Belle Sorenson Gunnes, born Brynhild Paulsdatter Storseth on November 11, 1859, in Selbu, Norway, would become one of the most notorious female serial killers in American history. She emigrated to the United States in 1881, settling first in Chicago, Illinois, where she began a life that would be defined by greed, manipulation, and a string of mysterious deaths. Belle married fellow Norwegian immigrant Mads Sorensen in 1884. Together, they owned a candy store, which soon burned down under suspicious circumstances, netting the couple a tidy insurance payout. Shortly afterward, their home also burned, yielding another claim. 2 of their children died young, reportedly of acute colitis, an illness with symptoms consistent with poisoning. Then, in July 1900, Mads Sorensen himself died suddenly on the very day his 2 life insurance policies overlapped, allowing Belle to collect a substantial sum. With that money, she purchased a farm in LaPorte, Indiana, and soon remarried to a man named Peter Gunnes. Peter's life was tragically short. Within a week of the wedding, his infant daughter died while alone with Belle. Only 8 months later, Peter himself was killed in a bizarre accident when, according to Belle, a meat grinder or sausage-making machine fell on his head. Few believed the story, but Belle walked away free and richer from yet another insurance payout. Widowed twice, Belle began placing Lonely Hearts ads in Norwegian-language newspapers, seeking a partner to share her farm and fortune. Suitors came from across the country, bringing with them their savings and valuables. Most of them were never seen again. Belle's neighbors noticed men arriving at the farm, only for Belle to later claim they went west or returned to Norway. In reality, she is believed to have drugged them, murdered them, often with a blow to the head, and buried their bodies in her hog pen or other parts of her property. In 1908, Belle's farmhand and occasional lover, Ray Lempier, began to clash with her. She fired him, and tensions escalated. On April 28, 1908, Belle's farmhouse burned to the ground. Inside were the bodies of 3 children and a decapitated adult female. The woman's identity was never confirmed, as Belle's body was smaller than her known size, fueling speculation that she had faked her death and fled. During the investigation, authorities uncovered the grisly truth of the farm. They dug up dozens of dismembered bodies from the property, men, women, and children, all believed to be Belle's victims. Estimates of her kill count range from at least 14 to possibly over 40. To this day, Belle Sorenson Gunnes's ultimate fate remains a mystery. In the summer of 1984, the Midwest was gripped by fear as 2 lovers, Alton Coleman and Deborah Brown, embarked on a cross-state killing spree that would leave at least 8 people dead, countless others assaulted, and entire communities paralyzed. Their crimes were so brutal and unpredictable that the FBI placed them on its 10 most wanted list while they were still on the run. Alton Coleman, born November 6, 1955 in Waukegan, Illinois, had a long history of sexual assault and violence before the killing spree began. He was charismatic but volatile, capable of luring victims with a friendly smile before turning violent. Deborah Brown, born November 11, 1962, in Waukegan, had been described as a quiet, sheltered woman with limited mental capacity. She met Coleman in 1983, quickly fell under his influence, and soon became an active participant in his crimes. Together, they formed a deadly bond. In May 1984, facing charges for sexual violation in Illinois, Coleman fled with Brown, sparking a 2-month rampage across Illinois, Wisconsin, Indiana, Michigan, Kentucky, and Ohio. They targeted strangers, friends, and acquaintances alike, showing no consistent pattern beyond cruelty. Their victims ranged from young children to elderly adults. Their first known murder was 9-year-old Vernita Wheat of Kenosha, Wisconsin, whom Coleman had befriended through her mother. He lured the girl away and strangled her, leaving her body in an abandoned building. Days later, the pair killed Toni Story, a 25-year-old woman from Illinois, and then attacked an engaged couple, killing the man and severely injuring the woman. In Gary, Indiana, they murdered 7-year-old Tamika Turks and severely beat her 9-year-old aunt Annie, leaving her for dead. In Dayton, Ohio, they bludgeoned and strangled 77-year-old Eugene Scott in his home. By July 1984, the FBI had added both Coleman and Brown to its most wanted list, a rare move for a couple. The intense manhunt ended on July 20, 1984, in Evanston, Illinois, when police, acting on a tip from 2 citizens who recognized them, captured the pair without incident. Coleman was tried in multiple states for various murders. He received death sentences in 3 states, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, though he ultimately remained in Ohio to face execution. Deborah Brown, due to her mental limitations and influence from Coleman, avoided the death penalty but was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole in Ohio. Alton Coleman was executed by lethal injection on April 26, 2002, at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility. Deborah Brown remains incarcerated, serving her life sentence. They collectively took the lives of 8 people, but unconfirmed estimates suggest higher. Larry William Eyler, later dubbed the Highway Killer, was one of America's most prolific serial murderers of the early 1980s, leaving a trail of brutal killings across multiple Midwestern states. His crimes targeted young men and boys, often hitchhikers or drifters, and were marked by extreme violence. Born on December 21, 1952, in Crawfordsville, Indiana, Eyler's early life was marked by family instability and emotional difficulties. By his 20s, he had embraced an openly gay lifestyle, though he struggled with internal conflicts and violent tendencies. Between 1982 and 1984, Eyler is believed to have killed at least 21 young men, though he was only convicted of a fraction of those murders. His modus operandi typically involved luring victims, often hitchhikers, sex workers, or young men he met in bars, into his vehicle with the promise of money, drugs, or a ride. Once alone, Eyler would bind them, subject them to sexual assault, and kill them. In several cases, he inflicted sadistic torture, and many victims' bodies were found abandoned in rural ditches, fields, or along interstate highways. The killings began drawing attention in late 1982 when multiple young men were found dead in Indiana and Illinois under similar circumstances. Law enforcement across jurisdictions began suspecting a single offender, but Eyler was adept at avoiding detection, frequently moving between states. Eyler's downfall came in August 1984 when he was arrested in Illinois after police found a young man bound and beaten in his apartment, alive but severely traumatized. Although Eyler was released at the time due to insufficient evidence for murder, police kept him under close surveillance. In September 1984, a highway worker discovered the body of 15-year-old Daniel Bridges, who had been struck with a knife more than 24 times and discarded in a trash bag. The murder was linked to Eyler through forensic evidence, including fibers and blood traces found in his apartment. He was arrested again and, in 1986, convicted of Bridges' murder in Illinois. He received the death penalty for that crime. While awaiting execution, Eyler made a shocking confession in 1990 to his attorney, revealing details of 21 murders he had committed between 1982 and 1984. In exchange for the confessions, Eyler sought to avoid the death penalty for his accomplice and occasional partner in crime, a man named Robert Little, whom Eyler claimed had been involved in some of the murders. Larry Eyler died in prison on March 6, 1994, from AIDS-related complications at the age of 41. His death left many of his victims' families without the full closure of trials, but his posthumous confessions confirmed suspicions that he had been responsible for one of the largest killing sprees in Midwest history. Derek Todd Lee, later infamously known as the Baton Rouge serial killer, was a predator whose crimes haunted Louisiana in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Born on November 5, 1968, in St. Francisville, Louisiana, Lee grew up in a troubled household, exhibiting early signs of aggression and peeping Tom behavior as a teenager. While he managed to stay under the radar for years, his dark impulses escalated into a series of brutal murders that would terrorize the Baton Rouge area. Between 1992 and 2003, Lee was linked to the deaths of at least 7 women, though authorities suspect the actual number of his victims could be higher. His victims, who ranged in age from their 20s to their 50s, were typically attractive, independent women. Lee's attacks were characterized by extreme violence, beatings, stabbings, and strangulations, often coupled with sexual assault. He stalked his victims, sometimes even breaking into their homes, and showed a chilling ability to blend into his surroundings, earning the trust of unsuspecting women before killing them. For years, law enforcement chased the wrong profile. Based on witness descriptions and flawed assumptions, investigators initially focused on a white suspect, believing the killer fit the stereotype of most U.S. serial murderers. This misdirection allowed Lee, a black man, to evade capture longer. His familiarity with the Baton Rouge area and his habit of moving quickly between crime scenes also made him difficult to track. The tide turned in 2002 when the murder of Charlotte Murray Pace, a former LSU student, and the subsequent killings of women like Pam Kinamore and Trinacia Dine Colomb prompted authorities to turn to DNA technology. A genetic profile linked these murders and ultimately matched Lee's DNA from an unrelated trespassing case. On May 27, 2003, Derek Todd Lee was arrested in Atlanta, Georgia, after fleeing Louisiana. He was returned to Baton Rouge, where prosecutors began building cases against him for multiple murders. In 2004, Lee was convicted of second-degree murder in the death of Geraldine DeSoto and sentenced to life in prison. Later that same year, he was convicted of the first-degree murder of Charlotte Murray Pace and sentenced to death. While awaiting execution on Louisiana's death row at the Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola, Lee maintained a low profile, rarely speaking publicly about his crimes. He died on January 21, 2016, at the age of 47 from heart disease. Anthony Edward Sowell, later branded the Cleveland Strangler, was born on August 19, 1959, in East Cleveland, Ohio. His childhood was marked by severe dysfunction and abuse. He grew up in a cramped home with his mother, Claudia Gertrude Garrison, and other relatives, where discipline often crossed into brutality. Neighbors would later recall that Sowell and other children in the house endured beatings and neglect, and some relatives reported being forced to strip naked in front of others as punishment. Sowell joined the U.S. Marine Corps in 1978, serving for 7 years and receiving an honorable discharge. But after returning to civilian life, his dark tendencies began surfacing. In 1989, he was convicted of unlawful sexual intercourse and assaulting a woman who had come to his home. He served 15 years in prison and was released in 2005, registering as a sex offender. After his release, Sowell lived in a modest 2-story home on Imperial Avenue in Cleveland. He blended into the struggling neighborhood, often offering alcohol to passers-by or inviting women into his home. But behind closed doors, Sowell's residence became a house of horrors. Between 2007 and 2009, he lured vulnerable women, often struggling with addiction or homelessness, into his home with promises of drugs or companionship. Once inside, many were beaten, sexually violated, strangled, and killed. Sowell disposed of his victims' bodies in unimaginable ways, burying them in shallow graves in his backyard, hiding them in crawl spaces, and even leaving decomposing remains inside the house. The stench of death eventually drew attention. Neighbors complained of a foul odor for months, which city workers initially blamed on a nearby sausage factory. The truth began to unravel in September 2009 when police arrived at Sowell's home with a warrant for sexual assault. Inside, they found 2 decomposing bodies. Over the next week, they uncovered the remains of 11 women, some skeletonized, others mummified, scattered throughout the house, yard, and basement. Sowell was arrested on October 31, 2009, after a brief manhunt. At his trial, prosecutors presented harrowing testimony from surviving victims who described being attacked, choked, and forcefully taken advantage of by Sowell before managing to escape. In July 2011, he was convicted on 82 charges, including aggravated murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault. He was sentenced to death. Anthony Sowell remained on death row at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution in Ohio, showing little remorse for his crimes. On February 8, 2021, he died in prison at the age of 61 from a terminal illness. Coral Eugene Watts, often called the Sunday morning slasher, was one of America's most prolific yet lesser-known serial killers. Born on November 7, 1953, in Killeen, Texas, Watts grew up in a turbulent household. He was a shy, socially awkward child, and by adolescence he had begun experiencing violent fantasies, often centered on women he found attractive but evil in his mind. He claimed these impulses were like pure hatred that only killing could relieve. In 1969, at the age of 15, Watts was arrested for assaulting a woman. Psychological evaluations revealed a low IQ, but also an obsession with attacking women. These early red flags went largely unheeded. After graduating from high school, he enrolled at Western Michigan University, but was expelled after being accused of stalking female students. Between 1974 and 1982, Watts embarked on a murder spree spanning Michigan and Texas, primarily targeting women between the ages of 14 and 44. He often attacked them early in the morning, which earned him his infamous nickname. His method was swift and brutal, knocking on doors, ambushing women as they left their homes, or attacking them while they jogged. He would strangle, stab, or drown his victims, usually leaving little evidence behind. Watts had a chilling motive. He claimed he killed women to prevent them from becoming evil. Watts was first arrested in 1982 in Michigan after a woman survived one of his attacks and identified him. In a controversial plea deal, he was allowed to confess to several murders in exchange for immunity from prosecution in those cases, serving time only for burglary with intent to murder. This agreement shocked many, as it meant that dozens of killings would go unpunished. In 1983, he was transferred to Texas authorities after being linked to more crimes there. The plea bargain in Michigan meant prosecutors in other states had to find new cases outside the deal to keep him in prison. Authorities feared his eventual release, knowing he had admitted to killing more than 80 women, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in U.S. history. That fear became reality when his 60-year sentence for burglary was reduced due to good behavior, making him eligible for release in 2006. In a desperate effort to stop him, Texas prosecutors reinvestigated an old case from 1982, the murder of Helen Dutcher, a 25-year-old woman Watts drowned in a bathtub. New witness testimony and evidence led to Watts's trial in 2004. He was convicted of Dutcher's murder and sentenced to life in prison, effectively ending his chance of release. Coral Eugene Watts died of prostate cancer on September 21, 2007, at the age of 53, in a Texas prison. His death closed a chapter on one of the most baffling and underpublicized serial killing cases in America. Authorities believe that his true number of victims will never be fully known, as many of his confessions were vague and some victims were never found.